Welcome, everyone. My name is Max Grossman, and I'm the director of the Joseph and Rebecca Meyerhoff Program and Center for Jewish Studies, which is also the home base for the undergraduate minor in religious studies and the undergraduate major in religions of the ancient Middle East. We are delighted to welcome majors, minors, friends of the center, regular students, faculty, administrators, staff, and especially our guests. Thank you to everyone who is here. We're delighted that you're part of our community and that you could make it here today. I'm very happy to be introducing you to the third in our new series of 5-point lectures, in which we welcome friends and colleagues to present on the 5 data points, moments of insight, or theoretical sparks that have stuck with them and shaped their work over the years. It's been our pleasure thus far in this series to host both Professor Michael Brenner of American University and our own Professor Marcia Rosenblatt to reflect on their scholarship and its framing. Given that both of these professors are modernists whose work focuses in Europe, we thought this was a good time to turn our vision in a number of new directions. Professor Rachel Schine holds a joint appointment here at University of Maryland in the Department of History and the School of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures, where she's on the faculty of the Arabic department. She's also a member of the Religious Studies faculty and last spring taught the core Religious Studies course, What is Religion? So we wanted to bring students from that class this year here to hear what they're missing. And also everyone, glad to have you all here. A few words about Professor Schine. Professor Schine earned a PhD in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations from the University of Chicago many years ago at this point. Several of them, in fact. After completing her PhD, she served as a postdoctoral associate and instructor of Arabic literature and culture at the University of Colorado Boulder in the Department of Asian Languages and Civilizations. I understand that she was also a humanities research fellow at NYU Abu Dhabi, but given that this was deep COVID, it sounds like it wasn't quite as exciting as it might have been. It's a pleasure to congratulate Professor Schine on the publication of her new book, Black Knights, Arabic Epic and the Making of Medieval Race, which explores the origins, literary functions, and social histories of Black protagonists in Arabic popular literature. Her work focuses especially on the language's longest epic, which I understand is 23,000 pages long in the original.
Oh, no, not nearly that long. It's more like 5,000 pages.
Oh, thank goodness.
Yes.
I think maybe I trusted Google. Should not do
That
that. But 5,000 is quite long enough. Thank you very much. In her presentation today, Professor Schine will discuss some of the key questions that have driven her research to date. Professor Schine, the floor is yours.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. First of all, I understand some of you are semi-compulsorily here, so I will try to make this as fun for you as possible. Second of all, to that end, I have some hopefully colorful and visually intriguing slides that you can ideally now see. Can I get confirmation that people can see these now? Excellent. Okay, so just to quickly sort of introduce myself in my own words, although Max did a wonderful job just now. A little bit about me. I work on histories of what we might now anachronistically call Afro-Arab relationships in pre-modern Muslim history. So let's just, for the sake of argument, set the domain or the threshold of pre-modernity / early modernity at like the 17th century AD, aka CE, Common Era, common to whom. But anyway, Muslim ruled domains or Muslim majority domains in the period between the rise of Islam in the 7th century and the 17th century, so 1,000 years, stretched between basically parts of West Africa, so what are now Morocco, Mauritania, Senegal, and Gambia, and what is now a region that we tend to refer to as Transoxiana, the places between the Oxus River and the Jaxartes, aka Stanland. So Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, those types of places. In terms of where I focus on in that whole Muslim world, I tend to focus on Arabic speaking or heavily Arabized spaces. Those would be what we now consider the Middle East and parts of Northeast and Central Africa. Of course, where Islam goes, Arabic education goes, but in terms of who was natively speaking Arabic or learning Arabic as a mother tongue, that's more what we're talking about. And within those spaces, within the Muslim world, those Arabic and Arabized spaces, or Arabic speaking and Arabized spaces, I tend to look specifically at how Arabic-speaking cultures represented people who tended to be called Sudan. The modern country, Sudan and South Sudan, takes its name from this term that literally means blacks. It's just the plural for the color black or black people. Because what I'm interested in is how that concept of blackness was thought to fit in with or push against people's ideas of things like Arabness and Muslimness. So, in other words, in my work, I'm interested in how people created and participated in ideas of difference and common ground that were expressed in terms of what we today tend to call things like race, ethnicity, and religion. So, if I had to give myself a brand as a scholar, I'd probably say that I'm a historian of identity. And I'm going to be talking with you guys today about how I think about doing histories of identity. And to do that, I'm going to basically give you two parts of the talk. So I have 5 points, but two parts. One part is going to be more applied, where I look at the tools that I use to do the specific types of history that I work on. And then I'm going to move on to sort of more meta level questions that background basically how I think about being a scholar in more general terms. Like what does it mean to me to be interested in history in the first place? So to that end, point number one. So, first of all, when I'm approaching histories of identity, I like to keep in mind an idea that we tend to have as sort of a slogan in our contemporary context, but that's also a great historiographical tool. And just quickly, historiography is the practice of or the question of how history gets written. So, history is not just an assemblage of facts, it's the fact that we've put all of those facts together in a specific narrative format to tell a certain story or focus on certain points. That's historiography. And when we're doing historiography, one of the things that I think is useful is to talk about people the way that they talked about themselves, call people what they want to be called, or rather to tailor that idea more to the task of the historian. I like to think about that as basically see what happens when you talk about people in their own terms, and then notice the cases where you cannot readily figure out how people would have talked about themselves in a given situation or how their terms of identification have been rejected or reanimated over time. Now, in terms of why this is useful for histories of identity, there are some faffy scholarly terms that I need to onboard you guys with in order to think about this, which is basically that when people work on histories of representation, they have two different terms that they use to describe in-group designations, the stuff that I would use to talk about myself in community with other people who share an idea of what we all are, and externally imposed designations of identity categories. Those terms are endonyms for the in-group stuff and exonyms for the out-group stuff. Endonyms and exonyms are not mutually exclusive. They tend to work in feedback loops. So for example, sometimes exonyms, even very derogatory ones historically, have been reclaimed. An example is reclaiming queer identities. Queerness was an externally imposed idea on certain types of sexual and gender expression, and people took those impositions and said, hey, I think this is cool and we should run with it and make it something that we actually own and incorporate into our authentic in-group expressions. Sometimes exonyms are actively overturned terminologically, but not socially. So an example of this in Middle Eastern contexts would be the so-called Berbers. So Berber or Barbar is a term used for indigenous North African groups that came into contact with Arabic speakers who took the word barbar, yubarbir in Arabic means to speak unintelligibly, directly from the Greek usage that gives us the word barbarian in English. The people who were Berbers historically would have, before being Berberized, identified mostly not with one another as all being one collective indigenous North African group, but by things like their tribe much more locally. I'm Kutama, I'm Masmuda, I'm Sanheja, so on and so forth. Today, though, a collective identity amongst Berbers has been taken up actively because it's politically useful for them to continue to be in solidarity, and they've just changed the name. They tend to refer to themselves now as Imaziren, or the singular Amazigh, free people. So contrasting that with the idea of being a barbarian, they're saying, no, we have our own language, and in our language, we're going to call ourselves the free people, but we're still going to keep our groupiness that was imposed from the outside, instead of reverting to a sort of pre-groupiness tribal idea. And sometimes endonymic usages in Middle Eastern and Islamic histories are used to coin exonymic terms. An example of this is the word Turk. Turk was a term used by certain Central Asian populations that ends up eventually expanding in Arabic to mean anyone coming from the East, whether they speak a Turkic language or not. So in other words, one of the things that you can see when you're doing history is if you track who's taking up these terms of description and who they're describing with them and when and where, you can already see that we're kind of starting to do things like histories of migration, of conquest, of assimilation, of conversion, of slavery, of liberatory politics, and so on and so forth. So the reason it's useful as a historian to think about what would people have called themselves and when do I get to know that or not is basically because it helps you question givens. Givens are the categoric terms that people use every day and treat as unremarkable, and so they come up in the sources a lot, but you shouldn't necessarily look at them as being something that's stable or eternal or fixed. Sometimes our sources do this questioning too. So this is where I go into quote land and show you areas that help me think about this better. So on the left-hand side of the slide, I have a quote for you guys to look at from a treatise written in the Abbasid period. The Abbasids were the second caliphal dynasty in Islam, as in they passed their rulership by heredity. They roughly occupied the period, depending on how you calculate it, between 750 and 1250 AD. And in the early Abbasid period, in the 9th century, there was a particularly prolific author, this guy named Al-Jahid, who grew up between Basra and Baghdad, two cities in Iraq. And Al-Jahid was known for his prose literature, and in particular a genre called rasail, or epistolary prose. And he wrote lots of treatises that fall within another genre that's a subgenre of epistolary prose called mafakhir, so boasting literature. And in particular, that was things like boasting about the value of the pen over the value of the sword, boasting about the value of the Turks over the value of the Arabs. Pick an underdog and as a literary and thought experiment, see how much you can brag about them. And one of these treatises that he has is a text called Fakhr Sudan al-Biden, Boasts of the Blacks over the Whites. So already that tells us a couple of things just in its title. It tells us that Al-Jahid had an idea of the existence of a category of people called Black, the existence of a category of people called white, and the idea that Black people in that arrangement are the underdog group, the one who needs this sort of fakhr, this boasting, to be written about them. And he opens his treatise with this scene. He says that there's this guy named Shaddad al-Harithi, an eloquent and scholarly man, who said, I asked a Black slave girl in the desert, to whom do you belong, Black woman? To the master of city folk, O bald one, she replied. Are you not Black? I asked. Are you not bald? She answered. How annoyed you are by the truth, I retorted. It is you that the truth has annoyed, she said. Do not be insolent if you want to be respected, and to desist altogether would be more seemly. Shaddad then added, when I spoke to her, I really thought that I was a match for even the people of Najd in eloquence. Najd is in Central Arabia, so it's where the sort of most Arabic-speaking Arabs are. But it says, by the time she left me, I felt I was not even a match for my slave girl. So there are a couple of things going on here in terms of calling people what they want to be called. One is that Shaddad goes up to this woman and assumes that he can, in a mundane context, refer to her by her Blackness and that she'll just answer to it. But she's retorting because she views that as insulting to her or disrespectful. Okay, fine, Baldy. And then he doesn't like that. And he's sort of saying, oh, she flipped the script on me. She's identifying me by a term with which I don't want to be identified because I view it as insulting. And now I have to reframe how I was identifying her. But the other thing that we're seeing, of course, is that this is a woman who is enslaved, who speaks eloquent Arabic, who is not a normative color or is designated by her non-normative color. Whether or not her skin is actually darker is a different thing from, we'll talk about that later. Anyway, point being, we don't know what, in the pre-being trafficked into slavery context, she would have called herself. We don't know what her family would have called themselves in their original cultural environment. Now, sometimes, even though one of the things that we're doing when we look at this primary sources, we're looking at all of these terms of identification and breaking them down and seeing what they're doing and not giving us, scholars focus on the wrong given in a web of givens. Or sometimes we pick which givens to keep or discard for reasons that aren't maybe the best reasons. And to that end, I have another quote that I use to think about this from two scholars of race and racialization in the United States, Omi and Winant. That's on the right-hand side of the slide. So one of the things that they write about is basically what work does thinking about race do versus thinking about ethnicity. And they say in this quote, how might ethnicity theory address the range of subgroupings represented in the US Black community? What distinctions might it employ? Haitians, Jamaicans, Francophones, Georgians, Northern and Southern, ethnicity theory has not delved to any significant extent into the meaning of these distinctions. There's a racist element in this substitution, in which whites are seen as variegated in terms of group identities, but Black people, quote unquote, all look alike. So to clarify what Omi and Winant are saying here, they're saying that we tend to, in scholarship, politely mask racialized Blackness in the language of ethnicity. So we take race and we sort of sub out the word ethnicity because we're uncomfortable with talking about race. We're uncomfortable with, as we can see in this interaction between the bald man and the Black woman, sort of looking at this and saying this is an instance in which she's resisting the racialized terms on which he's talking about her. We discard the given of race, in other words, because it scares and upsets us. But just replacing a word for Omi and Winant doesn't replace a thought pattern. More specifically, tossing the word race in the garbage, but holding Blackness in place, reproduces for them an unevenness between complex and variegated white identities and flat Black ones. Now, what Omi and Winant aren't quite saying here, but what I think is worth saying, is that ethnic categories that they're proposing that we look at instead, if we're going to actually break down Blackness by ethnicity, the way we break down whiteness into things like Irish Americans and German Americans and Ashkenazi Jewish Americans, so on and so forth, would also in themselves be scholarly impositions that are accounting for a very recent or contemporary history. In the sense that what they're breaking us down into, or breaking the US Black community down into, are Haitians, Jamaicans, Francophones, Georgians, Northern and Southern, and sort of asking, are any of these good categories? And what we can see if we look at these categories is we're already in the US. There's a Black community that is therefore diasporic. And also that when would that diaspora have occurred? When would these communities have become self-asserting in terms of ethnography? That's all at the very least post-16th century. So just to recap this, or rather just to bring this back to Middle Eastern history, Blackness is constituted a little bit differently in the history of the Middle East, but still entails diasporic formations that now would render prior ethnicities, like this woman who is Black and we don't know where she's from, unrecoverable to us. So for example, Blackness in the Euro-American context, when we talk about an African diaspora in the United States, and we're talking about all these categories, tends to mean Sahelian and Sub-Saharan West Africanness and the transitioning through the transatlantic slave trade, especially, but through transatlantic travel in general, to various parts of the Americas. In the pre-modern Islamic context, Blackness was a broader formation. It tended to redound to people from not just Sahelian and Sub-Saharan Africa, but the world's general South. So you would be considered Black in Arabic sources if you were from places like South Asia, so certain parts of India, like the Tamil region, Southeast Asia, so places like Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and further afield into the Pacific Ocean, so think like Polynesian islands or Australia. So one of the main ways that we can think about this quote, even though it's very much about the Euro-American context, is it pushes us to historicize categories. And the other thing that I really like about Omi and Winant's quote is that it pushes us not just to historicize the category of Blackness when we see it in different places, but to historicize the category of whiteness too. So one of the main ways that Blackness has historically been constituted is in its juxtaposition with invisibilized whiteness. What I mean by that is whiteness is tends to be presumed as the norm, and therefore we front other things about people than their whiteness when we're talking about them, which is why you get more variegated categories of ethnicity when you're talking about white people than when you're talking about Black people for Omi and Winant. And very similarly, for the histories that I work on, the big default category that stands in for whiteness in certain ways is Arabness. But Arabness, of course, is itself something that is not transhistorical, and that you can interrogate in similar terms to how you might do a history of whiteness in Europe and the United States. So in terms of who I look to think about that question, there's this guy named Peter Webb, who I really like. He basically looks at the history of something called ethnogenesis. When do ethnicities come to be? When do people start using a common term to talk about themselves in community with one another? And what he basically looks at is the transition between the pre-Islamic context and the Islamic context in the Arabian Peninsula. So Islam arises in the 7th century. The Prophet Muhammad is born around the year 570-ish, begins receiving the revelations that are going to end up being known as the Quran in the year 610, and dies in the year 632. And the Arabian Peninsula, just to give you guys a sense of this, is about 1,400 miles by 1,400 miles. It's a diamond, so it's pretty gigantic. And one of the things that Webb assumes is that, there's no reason to presume that throughout all of history, people who came from, say, Yemen or Oman to parts of the Levant, like Jordan, or to central Iraq, were looking at every single person they met along the way and going, hey, Arab, I'm Arab too. Hey, Arab, I'm Arab too. Similarly to the Berbers, similarly to Black people before they were racialized into Blackness, people probably had more local terms of identification. And the way that he sort of looks at this is he says, an ethnic community indeed can exist without leaving many written traces of its sense of homeland, but the question of ancient Arabian communal organization becomes even more surprising when we consider that from thousands of Arabian inscriptions, there are perhaps only 11 references to Arabs as a people. Instead of sustained signs of a self-expressed Arab community, we have instead a sparse and staccato record. 2 references to Arab, or Arabs, that come circa the 7th or 6th century BCE in Yemen, 500 years of silence, 5 Yemeni inscriptions meaning Arab from the 1st century BCE and the 3rd century CE, 1 4th century Syrian epitaph of a king enigmatically entitled the King of the Arabs, and 3 references to Arabs in Yemeni inscriptions between the 4th and 6th centuries. The small sample size is significant because pre-Islamic Arabians, even nomadic groups, did leave many written records referring to their communities, and inscription writing proliferated across Arabia from the 5th century BCE onwards. Hence, the complete absence of reference to Arabia as a homeland, coupled with only trace references to the word Arab, hinders attempts to adduce a swelling sense of Arab communal identity. So that was a lot. What does he mean by this? Basically, what he means is, prior to the rise of Islam, prior to the textualization of the Quran, which itself is going to be a big engine of people using the Arabic language and writing it down, a lot of our writing that we have from the Arabian Peninsula is in languages that aren't Arabic, because you had people speaking things like Himyaritic and Safayidic and Nabatean and so on and so forth, and writing in those scripts, even when they were writing Arabic. And B, it's epigraphy. It's stuff that people etched onto rocks, like Khalid was here, sort of little graffitis on your way through a place, and little prayers and stuff like that. And he says, and if you look at the whole mass of graffiti throughout all of the pre-Islamic period, you only have a few references to this word Arab. And even then, they don't always mean the same thing. Sometimes Arab is a way of distinguishing nomads from settled people or enemies from friends. It's relational. So what you can't really say until the rise of Islam is that we have a definitive idea of people in the Arabian Peninsula as Arab. And actually, one of Webb's hypotheses is it's Islam itself. It's the fact that people start taking this revelation that is in Arabi Mubin, in clear Arabic, the Quran, that calls itself an Arabic text, taking that language of revelation, taking that idea that it was revealed to a target first Muslim community, and spreading it outward, that you start to define Arabness because they're coming into new types of encounter and contrast with other cultures. So it's, of course, also, therefore, not until after the rise of Islam that you can start looking at things like what's the intersection point between Arabness and Blackness, because until then, you can't necessarily speak of either of the two being clear in people's minds in the way that we do after Islam. Hopefully that makes sense. So I guess 2.1, which again was know whose terms you're speaking in and why, we can also add in a couple of other caveats, which is know not just whose terms you're speaking in and why, but also where and when, because these things change. And that's what doing history is. It's doing delta, change over time. So to my second point, one of the things that I think about is the way that histories that are the way that these histories of labeling are entirely about humans doing social things. We're making these categories of Arabness and Blackness and whiteness and Muslimness. But at the same time, all of these categories love to play dress up as humans fulfilling or recognizing natural and biological imperatives. So in other words, social engineering loves to play biological dress up. I like to think about doing histories of racialization as basically being directly related to doing histories of community construction. And many communities throughout history have grounded themselves in terms of what makes them a community in an idea of kinship, or what Bridget Fielder in the bottom quote on the slide refers to as genealogy. She says the process of race making not only transfers race from a genealogical past, genealogy as in lineage, to future descendants, but differently through non-biological relations of adoption, horizontal relations of sexual kinship, backward genealogies of racial reflection from children to parents, or circular relations by which race is constructed and reconstructed ad infinitum. And so, one of the things that Fielder is saying here is that we tend to think of kinship and the things that play biological dress up and travel with them, like race or ethnicity or culture, as progressing in a linear way. Some people's bodies come out of other people's bodies, and so there must be a direct connection there. But the substance of those connections is always culturally contingent. So we have to ask in Muslim contexts, what was thought to connect some bodies and their cultural baggage to other bodies when we're asking basically, how did Muslims make community with one another? Or how did Arabs retain their sense of Arabness in a growing Muslim community? And so on and so forth. And we can answer that question a couple of ways. Way number one is, how do we talk about that connection normatively, which is to say, how did people just generally speak about what connected them to one another in community? And then number two is, how do we talk about edge cases? When do new types of body entering that community get problematized? Or when do different combinations of bodies get put under particular microscopes? In my work, for example, when I'm historicizing the relationship of Blackness and Arabness, I look a lot at figures who are in storytelling, so popular narratives, who are born unexpectedly Black to parents who don't identify with Blackness. And what tends to result from those instances is similar to what Fielder discusses in the quote. The child's social category, their Blackness, flows backward, and the parents' identities are then called into question on the basis of how their kid looks. So just to give you a couple of examples of this, there's an Arabic folktale called the Sirah of the Bani Hilal, or Sirah of the tribe of Hilal. It's first attested around the 12th century. And in that story, there's a main character, Abu Zayd al-Hilali, who's said to be born Black unexpectedly because his mother is infertile and struggling to conceive a child, and sees a crow in the forest and says, I wish that my child could be just like that crow, because the crow is really strong and powerful and is menacing the other birds. And she sort of says, even if he's Black. And then the kid is born Black. There's also another story that's attested around the 12th century that I have also worked on that has a protagonist who is born Black because he was conceived during his mother's menses. You're not supposed to have menstrual sex in Muslim ideas of purity law, so there's an obvious sort of cautionary element to that, that of course cannot literally happen. But what's especially interesting about these figures from our vantage point is that these cautionary elements of their stories aren't about mixing Black parents with white parents. They're about having other types of bad sex or tangling with forces that are beyond our understanding. And there's a basic reason for this that relates directly to models of lineage from Muslim contexts. So just to explain what I mean by this, in US contexts, we tend to have a model of bilateral and hypo-descent-based understanding of how heritage and inherited things like race or ethnicity, quote unquote, work. What I mean by this is, so bilateral descent is where both of your parents are viewed as equally contributing to what makes you you. So when you say in an American context, oh, I'm half Chinese and half Spanish, what you're saying is my mother gave me half of who I am, or my father gave me half of who I am, and therefore my identity is fractionalized on the basis of what I've inherited from both of them. And in US law, up until recent history, we took that fractionalization very seriously in the sense that if you can be half and half of something, implicitly, if you have a kid, then they can be a quarter and a quarter and a half of something. And one of the ways that this looks in US legal canons is the idea of hypodescent, aka the one-drop rule. The idea that no matter how distantly you have Black ancestry, you'll keep inheriting itsy bitsy bitsy pieces of it, and that means that you will always have that Blackness carried with you. This is not the way that identity and lineage and heritage were understood in Muslim contexts, which tended to have a unilateral and patrilineal model of descent. So, in other words, your father gives you your nasab, gives you your ethnic and tribal affiliation, and your mother kind of doesn't matter to this question. What this means is that you don't see mixed identities in the Muslim world in the same way. And that also you have a situation where, whereas US and European laws were often militating against things like miscegenation, saying basically we don't want Black and white people to get together, one of the things that Islamic law is trying to account for is the possibility that you might have, for example, woman from tribe A and man from tribe B make kid C, and you don't want that kid's loyalties to be split. You want it to be clear that they belong to their father's tribe, and that's not a question there. Now, this model, being the preeminent one in Muslim context, was not an inevitability. Historians point to a moment of transition that again comes from the rise of Islam, because first of all, religious communities tend to want to grow. Second of all, you tend to want belonging in that community to be unambiguous. And third of all, when one of the ways that you're growing is through physical territorial expansion, you're going to have to find ways to assimilate foreigners. So an example of how this looks in Islamic legal context is concubinage, the fact that you can marry up to 4 wives if you treat them all equally, but also have women in your household to whom you have sexual access through a relationship of ownership. And when they have children, they will become something called walad, where they can't be sold or gifted away from their families that purchased them, and where their sons will be born free with full standing inside of the owning family. So they'll actually be treated just as a regular son who's a full member of the family in the inheritance plan. And one of the things that my texts that I look at sometimes explore is the fact that category confusion nonetheless inevitably arises in situations where people who are raised as Black in daily life but are Arab on paper experience that tension. So, for example, one of the key figures that I look at is a kid named André ibn Shaddad, who's born to an Abyssinian mother and an Arab father, but who takes after, in terms of how he looks, his Abyssinian side. And so he constantly is trying to prove to people, no, I'm actually Arab, like I'm legitimately, technically Arab, and earn equal standing in his tribe. So, in other words, sometimes these rules work better for some people than for others. So one of the things that I'm particularly interested in when I do these histories is sort of what Josep Luis Mateo Dieste says here. He says the idea of mixture and the production of mixed people are phenomena of a political nature rather than mere descriptors of biological facts. So similarly to talking about people how they want to be talked about, you have to look at things like how do people talk about their families, because we don't exist as individuals, we exist in relationships. And the other thing that I'm interested in is basically the fact that one of the things that the disappearance of mixed categories through sort of patrilineal unilateral descent does is it means that on one level, Muslim societies are actually quite mixed. But on another level, there's something weird about using the fact that they are to talk about them in a way that sort of tries to recover or rescue that mixedness. This goes to a point that Jennifer DeVere Brody makes. She says, purity is impossible. And in fact, every mention of the related term hybrid only confirms a strategic taxonomy that constructs purity as a prior fictive ground, which is a lot of scholarly woo-woo. But a better way of putting it, or maybe a pithier way of putting it, is just the use of the concept of hybridity presumes the possibility of purity. They are two like inevitably connected concepts. If you're saying one, you're presuming the other. And the reason that this is important is because I don't want to impose the idea that societies have always been, because of the erasures of unilateral descent, more mixed than we thought them to be. And this is basically because we need to not be careful, or sorry, need to be careful rather, not to demand of our subjects in the past a politics that we want to see in our present. Very often, scholars, including very good historians, fall into a sort of neoliberal trap of extolling mixedness because we think of it as a byword for cosmopolitanism and multiculturalism. And we tend, meanwhile, to think about identifying on terms of things like kinship or striving to uphold continuity of a lineal structure to be something that's narrow or small-minded because we associate it with the politics of purity. But that's not actually how any of these pre-modern Muslims that I look at are talking about how they construct their family affiliations. Instead, a lot of these structures like concubinage or like clientage, walat, which is also a form of sort of attaching yourself to a patriline in Muslim societies, end up being discussed is as providing a simultaneous sense of continuity and further potentials for connection and addition. Through them, the Muslim world is essentially bound into a loose but growing family, and a lot of religions have similar precepts to this. Early Christians, for example, used the idea of being children of God as a means to transcend what was at the time typically referred to as genos, or an idea of an inherited nationhood, in both this world and the next. In Islam, one of the things that's kind of remarkable about these ideas of lineal connection is that they're strictly earthly concepts. The Quran actually has a passage where it says on the day of judgment, when the trumpet is blown, because that, elite day of judgment is here, the ansab bainakum, the lineal ties between you, will be as nothing, and you will not ask about each other, which is a way of saying basically you're not going to be able to ask your family to intercede for you on God's behalf or on your behalf in front of God on the day of judgment. There you will stand as an individual. In the real world, which is where we are now, you stand in relationality. And so what does it mean to bring people into community and to assimilate them into community? It looks like these ideas of what are sometimes referred to as agnatic and pseudo-agnatic relation, kinship and an attempt to construct further kinship. So, as I mentioned before, just to sum up point 2, these social connections love playing biological dress up. And I should have been a bit more specific when I said biological dress up, because basically the other thing that I want to add here is that social stuff loves covering itself in bodily fluids. So if when I said that our models of descent are social and not biological, you immediately went to yourself, oh no, but I have my mom's and my dad's genes, or oh no, but I have my ancestors' blood, or oh no, but I nursed at my mother's breast. Congratulations, you are covering a social construct in bodily fluids. Well done. Foucault, because every scholar has to go through a Foucault phase, so all of you guys who are future budding historians just know that you will go through a Foucault phase, and I'm so frickin' sorry, expresses this in his own way in his History of Sexuality, when he says, beginning in the second half of the 19th century, the thematic of blood was sometimes called on to lend its entire historical weight towards revitalizing the type of political power that was exercised through the devices of sexuality. Racism took shape at this point, racism in its modern biologizing statist form. So, okay, there's a lot going on there, but basically what Foucault is trying to say, I think, because one never knows what Foucault is actually trying to say, is that sex and blood don't necessarily intuitively go together. It's not as if when I have sex with somebody and we make bebe, that bebe actually gets all of my blood bits. But at the same time, that's the language in which, beginning in the 19th century, what happens when you create lineal continuity, reproduce, tended to be expressed is I'm passing down my blood. And so you then see laws about controlling for things like blood purity. You see the laws of hypodescent. The one drop rule is one drop of what? It's one drop of blood. And he says that this is an example of the legal apparatuses that start to look like racial laws, that start to look like laws that are regulating biology because they're policing for racial integrity. Does that kind of make sense? Okay. So when we're talking, meanwhile, about pre-modern Islamic societies and talking about how nesab was thought to literally transfer, we're not talking about blood. So just yeet blood out the window. We're talking about wombs and we're talking about semen. See, bodily fluids, isn't it fun? Sometimes we're also talking about milk. Pre-modern Muslim societies had an idea of milk kinship. Many of them still do, in which if you nurse with another woman than your mother, you become like that woman's child in the sense that her children become off limits to you for marriage. So you have milk siblings, and marrying them would be incest. Even if you didn't come out of that woman's body, if you nursed at her body, then that's a sharing of a fluid dynamic, literally, that puts you in her family in a way that forbids certain types of other legal contract and relation, marriage. So for some cultures, this also looks different. You share bones with your ancestors. In most Western ones, as I said before, you share blood. These physiological models tell us a lot about histories of science and of law, because those were often the institutions that helped to enshrine these ideas. Science and law, though, don't always agree, so you can also see instances where men with pens, the elites of a given society who are writing stuff down, tried to reconcile the two. So for example, in Islamic tradition, the Quran offers two stories about the creation of man. One is the idea that Adam was made from earth. So he's the first man, he gets a different story. The other is a more general one that I have on this slide. It says, and indeed, we created humankind from an extract of clay, that idea of Adam, then placed each human as a sperm drop or nutfa in a secure place. Then we developed that drop into a clinging clot, an alaqa. Then we developed the clot into a lump of flesh, a mudgha. Then developed that into a lump, that lump into bones, rather, clothed the bones with flesh, brought it into being as a new creation. So blessed is God, the best of creators. But the thing is that Islamic societies don't just stare at the Quran all day, every day in order to think about how the world works. They also take in all of the cultural stuff around them. And that included, throughout the early Islamic period, a lot of Greek texts. And in particular, their medical models often came from dudes named Hippocrates, as in Hippocratic Oath, and Galen. And in Hippocratic and Galenic medicine, semen is produced not just by men, but by women. So people first reconciled the idea of a dually gendered sperm droplet, one part female, one part male, with the idea of the nutfa in the Quranic model, and that's easy enough. But then also, as with most societies throughout history, Muslim scholars tended to live in patriarchal contexts. So they hierarchized the seminal fluids produced by men and by women, and their constitutive roles. So we can see sort of here that Catherine Cuney talks about this. She says many medical accounts report how a man's seed, when dominant, which it was usually thought to be, produces male offspring, while the woman's seed, when more powerful, produces female offspring. And some scholars note that the seminal fluid of a man is white and the seminal fluid of the woman is yellow. So they're different, but they're both thought to contribute. And so if you think about the ways in which these social concepts are being dressed up in biology, and that biology is being dressed up in very particular ideas of physiology, what you're seeing is that basically seemingly primitive fundamental materials like blood and guts and bones and milk and semen can carry us really far into the realms of thinking about the social and the historical, and how societies have constructed and operationalized what we end up seeing as primitive and fundamental and naturally constitutive of all of us. So in other words, if when you think about your relationship with your family, you think about it as a genetic relationship that's layered over by emotional resonances, you're probably a bit of a weirdo. Usually it's the other way around. You actually probably think about your family as a set of emotional relationships that have then been layered over for you with an understanding of the sciences of our times. And so when you think about the sciences of other people's times, and also the laws that are made based off of or in contrast to that science, then you're historicizing how did communities understand their integrity and their perpetuation. So, point number 4, given the hidden primacy of all of that emotional and social stuff, of the fact that we think about our families and communities through how we feel about them, not how we are literally bound together in terms of science and law, reading books of law and medicine doesn't always give us a full picture of how people. I tend, therefore, to look instead in my work at stories that people tell and how they incorporate those types of medical or legal or genealogical knowledge that have become socially ambient in a way that makes them entertaining, but also sensible narratives that everyday folks can engage with. So here's where, as point 4, I step up on my soapbox and extol the virtues of using fiction as a historical source, because stories aren't real, but they have real consequences. Storytelling is more synthetic than many other types of historical source. It's something that tends to take a whole bunch of elements from culture, from science, from law, from all of these things, put them in a blender, and then spit out big arcs of plot and character. And the fancy scholarly term for dumping out all of those shared motifs and allusions is intertextuality, the fact that texts tend to talk to other texts. In another sense, though, storytelling is also rawer than a lot of other sources, in that almost all of us see ourselves at some level as characters who move through plot lines, not as composite mind bodies who move through systems of social management. So in other words, I tend to use stories to think about how people actually talk about community and racialization in terms that felt authentic to them. In order to use a source, it of course has to exist in a way that I can access it though. And so how storytelling shows up in the historic record of Arabic-speaking Muslims also has a history that I'm concerned with. Most textual sources from pre-modernity are by those men with pens that I mentioned earlier, learned elites who had gone to madaris or formal schooling past adolescence, and who were knowledgeable in things like fiqh or Islamic jurisprudence and ulum or those sciences that I mentioned before. Stories like the ones that I study that have your Antaras and your Abu Zaids and your Abdul Wahabs and so on tended to circulate amongst less literate people and without as much prudishness about authority and authorship. So they weren't always written down in full or in the same ways, if at all. And it's not until a historical era that historians call the Mamluk period, from the 1250s through 1500s, that we start to get full texts of the types of folktale that I'm using to do these social histories. Conrad Hirschler talks about the fact that when that textualization starts happening, on the one hand, there's a popularization of knowledge, of literacy, a big uptick in people interacting with text during this period. But on the other hand, that this poses a threat to the men with pens. It says that this affects in one way or another the near monopoly by scholarly and administrative elites on the written word, as wider groups in the population started to use a mode of communication that was endowed with increasing cultural and social authority. So, in other words, elites tend to not only work on stuff amongst themselves that trickles into other parts of society, but tend to be anxious about other parts of society picking up what they put down, because we're all anxious about reception. The most famous case of this in Islamic history is probably a guy named At-Tawhidi, who said after he died that he wanted all of his books to be burned so he couldn't have anybody pick them up and run with them. I'm not that extreme about it. But one of the things that you can kind of see when you look at the sorts of stories that I look at in order to understand how did people respond to or continue to circulate and traffic in narratives of Black characters is that they were people who you might interact with on the street and not in the courthouse, that you might interact with on the street, but not in the caliph's majlis. So for example, these are all notes taken by a guy named George Vida on manuscripts of stories that were accessioned by the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, the French National Library. And they're all manuscripts of the different folk tales that I was talking about before. One of them says that it has a renter's note from a Hekaweti, a storyteller, so somebody who would have taken out a volume in order to tell stories from it, from a guy who's a boulanger, a baker, an ajjan in Arabic. One of them is a manuscript that's composed in one of its volumes of 3 different parts. Part 1 is in 2 hands, part 3 is unfinished. So you can kind of see that there were whole communities that were trying to make these stories or use these stories and tell these stories. And they tend to not be the communities that we think about when we think about doing history, if we just look at elites. So in other words, these are the sorts of people who were attracted to stories that had Black characters or even had a hand in shaping them in a variety of political contexts, but their contributions to discursive trends tend to be more anonymous or undervalued or both, and that's what makes them interesting to me as a historian. The everyday politics of race is what I want to think about. And with that, point 5, last point, I promise. I tend to not use my research where I'm looking at deeper histories of what we now call things like race in a Euro-American context to say that I have found the origins of anything. So even though I'm looking at stuff from literally 1,000 years ago, one of the things that I try to keep in mind as a historian is when people say, I found the invention of bloop, or I found the origin of blop, what they actually mean is I found the limits of my disciplinary ability to account for the history of bloop or blop. I have a very good friend who sort of turned me on to this idea, Arafat Razek, who looked at the fact that basically if you look at books about the history of race that were published recently, here's just an array of the titles. None of them are my title. I have a different title. The invention of racism in classical antiquity, the invention of the white race, the invention of race in the European Middle Ages, the origin of racism in the West. And every single one of these books puts the origin date and the origin context of whiteness, of race, of racism in a different time and often in slightly different places. So what this means basically is that disciplines have histories too, and that you have to think within what claims you as a historian can actually make on the basis of the evidence, not because it's sexy to make that claim, not because it's splashy to make that claim, but because it's a claim that you feel you can substantiate and support. And in terms of the additional curlicue of the perniciousness of this, I also really like David Nierenberg's quote, and maybe this is where I'll finish because I had a bonus point, but I'll maybe make that bonus point part of the Q&A. He says, basically, when we look at a long-durée history of things like racialized Blackness, of things like race and racism, he says, in every case, we could claim that we had discovered within these religions the actualization of one potential among many, the potential to map the reproduction of culture onto the reproduction of the organism, which is what I've been talking about this whole time, basically, ideas of community construction being coterminous with ideas of racial construction and coterminous with ideas of reproduction. And he says we can and should compare that actualization to other mappings in other times and places, and ask how these relate to one another, and how they might contribute to a critical history of and theory of race. But we should not imagine that the actualizations we discover constitute the origins of racism or the essence of those religions. When we do so, we ourselves yield to a historical logic of lineage that is itself akin to that family of concepts we call race. I think he said it better than I could, so I'm going to shut up now and leave it to a Q&A, and hopefully that was somewhat coherent. Those are my 5 points.
Thank you so much, Professor Schine. What a pleasure. What a joy. I have lots and lots of questions for you. I suspect that our audience will have questions as well. Would you like to stop sharing your screen and we can encourage
Yes.
people to turn their cameras on? We can always go back to the screen. If you have questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat or raise your hands. While people are formulating their questions, and I hope you will, I wanted to start with one quick question, if I may. And then please, other folks, feel free to put questions in the chat or raise your hand or turn your screen on. Um, I know that I've been thinking a lot lately about what it means to talk about origins and essence. And when we think about religious studies, whether you're talking about the origins of a specific religion or the origins of that religion, it's almost like making a claim about origins and essence engage and intersect with each other, and people will
Mhm.
sometimes use one to define the other. How do you negotiate, given that you're not going to look for origins? Um, how do you negotiate the problem of talking about something as complicated as representations of race, specifically in Islam, specifically in this time and place? How do you deal with the tensions between origins and essence? And do you have an alternate strategy that you can give us for that?
That's an interesting question.
As
Um,
opposed to saying your entire outlook. Like, do you have an aha moment somewhere where you kind of went, "Oh my gosh, origins are a problem."
I don't know if I had an aha moment where I said origins are a problem, but I did have a bit of an aha moment where I said, oh, essence is a problem. Because on the one hand, of course, essence is a problem in the historicization of race. The idea that people carry immutable, biologized, primordial essences with them that construct not only their color, but their culture throughout history is itself a problem. But the other thing that's a problem is, and this is expressed very well in the scholarship of a guy named Bruce Hall, who works on West African Muslim histories, the problem of assuming that a given culture's concept of things like those reproductive essences is untranslatable within other cultures.
Mm,
That there's sort of an essential and irreducible difference between how other people talk about themselves and how we talk about ourselves. Because you can watch people bridge that divide over time and watch
mm,
people legitimate the terms of use that other people have used to talk about their own histories. What I mean by this is one of the things that Bruce Hall looks at is the fact that there are communities in the modern Middle East and Northwest African context, like the Haratin of Mauritania or like the Akhdam of Yemen. These groups of people that have been historically viewed as being of sub-Saharan African heritage, they're raised as Black in their societies, and they are often also underclassed. And in order to describe their long-durée experience of being
mhm,
placed in those categories and continuously underclassed, they refer frequently in modern activist contexts to the language of Ansoriya. Ansoriya is a modern Arabic coinage to render the English term racism into Arabic. When
mm,
people talk about the idea of racialized groups in Arabic, they tend to refer to them as uruq, which is a term that itself comes from earlier usages, meaning your roots or your
mm,
origins, basically. But an actual term for racism uh, was basically imported from Euro-American experiences and concepts of racism into the Arabic-speaking context. But when communities that feel as though they have been subject to those dynamics or subject to things that look a lot like those dynamics and want to be in solidarity with or participate in global conversations about anti-racism take up those terms, one of the things that Bruce Hall says is there's nothing illegitimate in this move, and you can't say that this is somehow culturally inauthentic to these people.
mm,
You can't look at that and say, well, no, the essence of your experience is categorically different because it happened prior to the importation of this particular word, because this is how they're choosing to describe it.
yeah.
So you have to notice that there's a comparison that's being done for you there, and then interrogate why that comparison is salient. Not just sort of say, I don't agree with this terminology. I'm not going to use the same language that the activist communities in XYZ place use.
Mhm.
So don't, in other words, be prissy about it as a scholar is, I guess, maybe the best way I would answer that question. And also the most annoying way, because that doesn't really say much other than me having a bad attitude.
Nope, this is great. Are there folks with other questions? I have like 6 or 7 more, but I'll try to restrain myself. Thank you to people who put their cameras on. Please feel free to raise your hand put on your camera, put a question in the chat. I'm not going to cold call on people like I do in class because I want to give you an opportunity. Alina, are you interested in speaking? Having said I won't cold call on people.
Maybe. I just didn't want to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
This is kind of a simple question, but I'm just curious. You talked about the concept of hyper descent, which makes a lot of sense, like living in America, you hear about that all the time.
Mm.
I just didn't know the word for it before, but um in Islamic societies, during the time of Muhammad and all of that, you talked about instead how, like, instead of race, it was kind of more based around what tribe you belong to and how the paternal line de determined which tribe you belong to. Was
Mhm.
there any kind of similar concept of hyper descent in terms of tribal lines? Like you mentioned, like, if your dad came from one tribe and your mom came from the other, you belong to your dad's tribe. But was there ever any like question of loyalty, like, oh, because your mom's from this tribe,
Mm.
this, a question of loyalty or whatever?
That's a great question. And basically, there's a whole conversation that I didn't really bring in because I didn't want to talk too much about basically um, when does the idea of nesab or the idea of tribal lineal inheritance become conclusively paternalized, which is to say, when does it end up being the case that it's really just your father who dictates this? And it seems to be throughout something called the Umayyad period. So after the Prophet Muhammad dies in the year 632, there's about 30 years of a period called the first four caliphs or the Rashidun caliphs, all of whom are in-laws of the Prophet Muhammad, the third of whom is a guy named Uthman, who is from a tribe called the Banu Umayyah. And after the fourth of these caliphs passes away, or rather is assassinated, Uthman's relatives end up surging into that power vacuum, and they create a dynasty called the Umayyads. And prior to the Umayyads, one of the things that was happening is, first of all, Islamic law, because the Prophet Muhammad was like so recently alive, has not yet fully crystallized. So none of these ideas of like descent and inheritance are totally stabilized yet. And second of all, you see many more attestations of an idea of mixed identity. For example, the word
Hmm.
hajin tended to mean somebody who had a non-Arabian or non-tribally affiliated mother and a tribally affiliated father. So not just in terms of mixed tribalness, but also in terms of Arabian tribal standing versus not even having it. So Antara ibn Shaddad, with his half Abyssinian lineage, would have before Islam been a hajin, for example, because his mother didn't come from Arabia. And under the Umayyads, it seems to have been the case that basically, in order to keep it in the family, if you will, keep continuity of the Umayyad dynasty and sort of diffuse threats or concerns about caliphs within the Umayyad line having split loyalties where they're going to not really, they're going to favor not just the Umayyad side, but also their mother's tribe and give her special favors and all this sort of stuff. That's when you start seeing more of a focus on paternity. And the other reason you start seeing more of that focus is because this is a period of rapid expansion. So it's not just that there are tribal dynamics, it's that you also now have, they've taken over tons of Byzantine territories, tons of Persian territories, tons of East African territories. And now you have people who have no standing in the tribal matrix, people who are Coptic or people who are Syriac speaking Christians who are, Levantine ethnicities of various kinds that weren't Arab and so on and so forth, coming in as either wives or concubines to these caliphs. And one of the things that they wanted to be able to say at the end of the day is, yeah, but we're still fully Arab and fully entitled to rule the Muslim community, that which is, it has an Arabness at its core because that was the language and context of revelation. So Arabness ends up being sort of this pious mechanism almost that the Umayyads are using as something that they can continue to inherit and propound as long as you just pay attention to dad. Who's dad?
But
Um,
then Arabness also expands, right? Arabness itself is transformed by that.
yeah, absolutely. So the other thing that we see in the Umayyad through early Abbasid period is a shift in what Arabness means. Because for a while, if you look at the earliest Arabic dictionaries, like the Kitab al-Ain, for example, Arabness means someone who speaks Arabic. Basically, in terms of how the dictionaries are defining it, and granted, not everybody was going by a dictionary definition of anything. But the thing is, when you've conquered a bunch of places and people are learning Arabic as a way of participating in politics, as a way of participating in the society of the people who now rule them, um, that's going to really expand the definition very quickly. So then you see people starting to resort to, no, actually Arabness is something that you pass down from, fathers to children. So on the one hand, that's a constriction, but on the other hand, you have these things like concubinage, like clientage, that allow for somebody who has that lineal heritage to pass it on to new people in new ways. So it's contracting the terms of who gets to claim it, but also expanding how they can claim it. Does that make sense?
So basically the rapid expansion and inclusion of other kind of cultures and other peoples kind of forced them to redefine what it meant to be Arab.
Exactly. Yeah, that was much pithier than how I expressed it. Thank you for fixing the way that I expressed it.
No, it was a really good explanation. I mean, I got there, so thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, awesome. Thanks.
Are there other folks who would like to join in?
Thought I saw a hand. Malik, did you have your hand up?
I did. Thank you. Hello, Dr. Schine. Um, um, I hope I articulate this question clearly. One of the things that I'm wrestling with as I listen to this is trying to tease apart what it means to be Arabic, what it means to be Muslim, and how Arab customary tribal law is working in tandem with Islamic law in terms of determining who belongs to the community, and where those two things are coming in conflict with each other. Again, because it occurs to me that one of the functions of Islam is to function as sort of a meta ethnicity, in which which Islam are part of the kin group, so to speak, in a spiritual sense. So I guess I'm wondering how these ideas about race are being and to what degree these ideas about race are being determined by Arab custom versus Islamic law.
Absolutely. That's a great question. So first of all, to your initial point, not all, and I should have said this at the beginning of the talk, like not all Arabs are Muslim, not all Muslims are Arab. If you look at Muslim demography today, which is about 2 billion people worldwide, it's mostly a African and South Asian religion, mostly not demographically Arab. There are Arab Christians, there are Arab Jews, although the terms under which people claim Arab Christian identity and Arab Jewish identity are themselves quite modern. The idea of these hyphenated categories are also, those are new. And so one of the things that I can use to answer your question basically is how did people who were at the edges of this Arabian tribal system, these customary laws of how do you reckon and seb these lineages from a pre-Islamic context, graft themselves onto the family tree, which is, I'm borrowing a term from another scholar, Zoltan Sombati, who talks about this a little bit. And there were a few different ways that they did so. The most obvious one is to try to claim some kind of linkage to the Arabian Peninsula and therefore to one of these tribes. So for example, you have a lot of Central African dynasties that arise and say, oh, we are actually distantly descended from these groups in Yemen and stuff like that. And that's also bearing forward conquest and proselytization histories, where what they're kind of saying is we have these linkages because these are the people who brought us our Islam, and they were some of the first Muslims, so it routes us back into the beginning of the story. Another way of doing it, though, is the fact that Islam absorbs basically all of the prophets of the Jewish and Christian tradition, in addition to there being 4 Arabian prophets. And so, for example, there was an attempt on the part of Persians who in early Islamic context tended to be referred to as kind of the default foreigners. There was, the Arab, and then there was the Ajam, the non-Arabic speakers, but usually it was a term just used for Persians, people from Sasanian territories. And some of them started saying, oh, well, we're descended from Ishaq, and the Arabs are descended from Ismail. So we're Isaac's kin, and they're Ishmael's kin, which means that we're half-brothers, which means that we're part of the prophetic origin story that backgrounds this entire tradition, which kind of inevitabilizes their Islamization, the idea that this is a community that is from prophets and is sort of ready to absorb the truth. That explanation didn't have legs because one of the ways that ethnicity works is that people have to pick up what you put down. And a lot of Arabs looked at the Persians making that claim and said, we don't buy it. But that was the nature of the conversation. So one of the things that I think you're asking is basically, how did people in the early Islamic period who were outside of these pre-Islamic Arabian systems understand them, interpret them, and try to get in on them? And one of the ways that they did so was sort of saying, well, we don't need the tribal system, we have the prophet system. Does that kind of make sense?
Yes. But I think part of what I'm wondering also is how if I don't know if this is the case, but whether or not those Arabian customs or those Arab customs rather came into conflict with Islamic law at any point, and how did that play out in
Yeah,
determining who
absolutely.
belonged to the community? Yeah.
Absolutely. So one of the things that the Quran enshrines is Islam's universality, the idea that it, even though the Quran is revealed rather in Arabic and revealed in a context, it is not just for the people to whom it's immediately revealed, it's a universal truth. And to that end, one of the things that the Quran affirms over and over again is that God created people with human diversity, turned them into qaba'il, tribes, and shurub, peoples, and gave them different alwan, colors, and adsan, languages, in order to show his creative genius as a sign for people to recognize, and that when we recognize it and get to know one another, we're kind of doing God's work. When you universalize principles, you're kind of recognizing the fundamentals that underlie all creation. So one of the things that you see in the discourse of Islamic law and its friction with Arabian tribal systems is a discourse where one of the things that the Prophet Muhammad tried to sort of ban was ta'an fil ansab, making fun of people on the basis of their lineage or denigrating them on the basis of their lineage or giving them lower social positions. Because he said the only thing that should define where your status is in society is your taqwa, is your piety. So oftentimes there's a pious counter argument. In terms of the actual legal counter argument or the lineal shift, that's the sort of stuff like the paternalization of nasab that we see in the Umayyad period that I was talking about. So there's the legal level, and then there's also the sort of theological or discursive level at which you have these conversations taking place and these tensions being brought to bear. I don't know if that answered your question further, but
No, it does. That was very helpful. Thank you. Yes,
yeah, no problem.
Can I push you a little bit methodologically here?
Sure.
This week I had the pleasure of reading Julius Lipner's piece on the making of Hinduism, which a colleague recommended to me. That would be you. And we talked in class about the idea of big categories that become a way of talking about more complicated things. And one of the students in class just said the most wonderful thing. I apologize, I don't remember who you were, but somebody said, as someone who can pass for Hindu, I have this experience of, a majority Hindu culture where Hinduism becomes not a religion, but a kind of cultural framing. We've also talked a lot in our class about the U.S. framing of religion that is both not Christian and entirely Christian, and that for Christians who identify as Christians, the Christianness of America is a problematic category. Can you speak to how we as students of religion might negotiate the problem when larger systems have the same names but do different things, or when religion and ethnicity and claims of national origin all kind of interpermeate? What's some of the work that we can do to negotiate that?
That's a great question. I teach a class called The Making of Middle Eastern Identities, which is basically taking this up as its central question. So if anyone wants
So
to
you
take
mean we need 14 weeks for you to answer this
I
question?
need, yeah, at least 14 weeks. But the best way I think I can answer it is that the mess is there. And then the question is really, when are people activating certain versions of the mess and for what reasons?
Nice.
So for example, I'm trying to think of a good example of this. when Arabic-speaking Muslim authors are treating it as obvious that people who are Muslim speak Arabic,
Mhm.
and specifically that people who are Muslim speak Arabic and that their families have for generations, that's activating a specific idea of who is at the center of a society and who you're going to focus on as being either normative or being original, and therefore elevate.
Mhm.
You have interesting dynamics, like, for example, in the Abbasid period, there's this guy named Ibn Qutayba, who is a Khorasani Persian. But the Khorasani Persians were key to the Abbasid revolution that positioned the Abbasids to take over from the Umayyads. They basically coup them out of existence. Um, and one of the things that Ibn Qutayba does is he writes his own version of Mafakhir. He writes his own text called the Fadl al-Arab, the virtues of the Arabs, as a Khorasanian Persian, where he says
Mm.
basically like, no, the Arabs are the best of us. The Arabs do have this rightful, legitimate position, which is very convenient for Ibn Qutayba because he's directly inside the Abbasid bureaucracy and benefiting
Mm.
from the fact that the people who are the primary power holders put him there and doesn't really want to disrupt the status quo. As so often happens, people who are not necessarily the top of society can still be okay with the status quo as long as they're benefiting from who is at the top, even if they identify on different terms. And so one of the things you can do is you can use that text to see, okay, why is this guy who's this Persian like throwing down so hard for the idea of like basically Arab superiority? And is this because of how he understood himself? Is this because of his social position? Is this because the Arabs were actually superior according to the metrics that he's using? What metrics is he using? All of that sort of stuff. And then also you notice as you're doing that, oh, wait, he's actually using Arabness to talk about legitimate Muslim rule. Who should be in control of the caliphate? How should the caliphate transfer? How should power look?
There's
Um,
like a subaltern negotiation going on here.
yeah, exactly. So not only who's activating it, why, but also like cui bono, who benefits from it being activated this way.
I
Yeah.
think who benefits is a very important point. I want to make sure that anyone who needs to leave in the next few minutes has a chance to speak if they want, whether you are a visitor, whether you are a campus person. Please take this time. I know we have some experts of all sorts here. I'm going to push harder on this aha moment thing, because in some ways the 5 points lecture is designed to get you to say, this is when I said, oh. And I'm curious because you're clearly someone who studies all of these different matrices. And I keep hearing the word power in the back of my head, whether you're talking about religion or race or imperial dynamics. What can you think of one moment where you were like, oh, I need to tease this out? Did it happen as early as your undergrad years that you were like, oh, wait a minute? Or is this something that came to you later on? Did you go to grad school because you had a problem you needed to solve intellectually? What's the intellectual autobiography here?
I think, okay, that's an interesting question. I don't think that I went to grad school because I had a specific question. I went to grad school because I had too many questions and thought, oh,
Nice.
maybe if I just keep going to school, I'll answer more of them. And that proves to not be the case because questions proliferate, answers do not. That should have been one of the points. Um, but one of the times where I had that aha moment in early graduate school that set me on the path to sort of writing the book that I wrote was when I read this that story of Abdul Wahab, who is born in this like story, Sirat al-Amirat al-Himma, which is the longest epic in the Arabic language, 5,000 pages, that reflects on the Arabo-Byzantine wars of the 7th through 9th century. So it's looking mostly at the Turkish and Syrian frontiers of a long war between the Byzantines, aka Eastern Rome, and the Muslims, who were mostly coming from the Arabian Peninsula and expanding northward. And there's this kid who's born to one of the heroines in the text, who identifies herself as being Bayda, white, and Arab, and her spouse, who likewise, and is born black. And the thing that I was trying to do with this text when I first started working with it is look at the fact that the woman in the text is the person for whom the text is named. Dat al-Himma was the nom de guerre of this woman named Fatima Dat al-Himma, Fatima, the possessor of ambition, who had risen in the ranks and was, you know, a folk general who was majorly popular. It's, oh, thank you, Alina. A story that is the only epic in the Arabic language titled for a woman. I was going to look at the gender dynamics, obvious point. And then I realized I can't really talk about gender and her like warrior identity if I don't talk about her maternal identity and how that sort of puts her warrior identity under threat. And I can't talk about her maternal identity if I don't talk about her kid. And oh, wait, look at her kid. And then I realized there was a much more interesting story to tell there about what's going on with ideas of sexuality, with ideas of heredity, with ideas of blackness and whiteness, with ideas of how this child is going to move through the world in ways that are frankly analogous to his mother because he's underclassed on grounds of his racialization and she's underclassed on grounds of her gender. This is what makes them both underdogs. How are gender and race similar? How are they different? Why can't I find stuff about racialization and pre-modernity? Oh, wait, that's because people like Foucault think it started in the 19th century. How do we historicize what looks to me like racialization if I can't use the word? Can I use the word? And so that's the thing where I had the aha moment of like, crap, I need to theorize my way out of this hole. And that's very often how books get written. I apologize to everyone that, you know, if you have this experience, this unfortunately might mean that the side effect is a book.
It does happen. It does indeed happen. And I do remember a story of a sociologist friend of mine dancing around and saying, Durkheim was wrong, Durkheim was wrong. So it's possible that you were giving Foucault the back of your hand at some point here.
Yes. Well, we all have to at some point.
Yes, indeed. Other folks?
All right, I guess I have a question. I was just interested on like how sort of the term Arab came to be. You said that it was really like the rise of Islam that caused like kind of the Arabic identity to happen. So one of your points was almost, how like how can you say, I found the origin of something, you know, how can you say I found the origin of racism or the origin of race? So I guess, how can we be sure that like, Islam caused, Arabic to be or Arab to be a term?
That's a great question. And 10 out of 10 for interrogating my own like points on my own points. The word Arab is a word that is shared in a bunch of different Semitic languages besides Arabic. So Arabic is related to things like ancient Assyrian and Aramaic and Hebrew and Amharic. And the basic question that Peter Webb is asking is not sort of where does this word originate or when does this word originate, because it's used in a lot of different languages around the Arabian Peninsula and inside of it, but rather when does it start to be the primary way that people, sorry, that's my dog, denote their idea of a shared groupness that traces to a specific territory, a specific culture, a specific heredity. In other words, when do you start going from Arabs are in the room, to Arabness being something you can speak of? And the reason that he feels fairly secure in locating that in the Islamic context is basically because of what I talked about before, those dynamics of, oh, thank you, Jedediah, those dynamics of expansion that force the issue of self-articulation. And one of the things that he says in that quote that I had on the slide is, people not leaving a written record of something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But he sort of says this is when we get an outpouring of a written record. So in other words, we're seeing not only people caring about using this word, but maybe people caring about preserving their usage of this word to mean these specific things. So that's not really, I mean, okay. Webb might phrase that as him having found the origin, and good for him. I would phrase that more as him having found a very interesting uptick and consolidation. Does that, I don't know if that makes sense. Prior usages of Arab, by the way, in the Arabian Peninsula mostly meant nomads. So you see references to not Arab as in like just the ayin ra ba, but Arab as in alif ayin ra alif ba, to mean basically people who were non-sedentary. And you especially see that in the central and northwestern portions of the Arabian Peninsula, that's the way that they're being described. Those are the people that modern historians tend to refer to as Bedouins. Bedouin is itself a word taken from Arabic meaning camp. Bedu just means a campsite. So one of the things that's kind of interesting is that it might have been a term in a lot of its more organic usages, not to indicate an ethnicity so much as a lifestyle that differentiated you. And this is also kind of how the word Turk starts getting used in Arabic. Turks are primarily distinguished from Tajiks, nomadic people from Central and East Asia versus settled people from Central and East Asia. So this is something that you see also in terms of how do people historicize identity is like, are we talking about, and Max, you were using because I use them, the race, ethnicity, religion triad, or is it actually race, ethnicity, religion, life way, quadruplets? All of which merge with one another in interesting ways.
Yeah,
But
thank you so
thanks.
much. Yeah, that was very thorough. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Lovely, Anne. I want to complicate things even further because I'm wondering if the terminology that we use to designate ourselves and the terminology that we use to designate others might in fact not be a reference to a sort of film or filter that kind of hovers vertically between. And I say film or filter because I'm thinking about something that's both permeable and something that can kind of like the mirror can look this way or the mirror can look that way. And the parallel that I'm thinking of is actually the 20th century feminists in France and the sociological tension between, sorry, this is so off field, but I think it's actually a perfect example because the sociology of feminism in elite French 20th century culture was one where a lot of women who came out of the Lacanian, post-Freudian, psychoanalytic, radical perspective on society, whom you have to call a feminist because that's what they were, they would say, I am absolutely not a feminist because a feminist is that other person. It's a bourgeois, rich, non-socialist person. So I am not a feminist because I'm not that. Another good example of this is in Angels in America, where a character says, I'm not a homosexual because homosexuals are people who cannot get a simple gay rights law passed. I'm a man who sleeps with men. So the term itself, which is sometimes self-evidently descriptive of a collective, might in fact also be something that people reject because of how it's been played. So in some ways, I mean, I see this with religious studies because almost every religion you encounter says we are not a religion. And you could almost argue the way you know something's a religion is if people say we are not a religion. So is that kind of filter and film a possible piece in all of this?
Absolutely. Especially when you think about basically how accountable do people feel to ideas from their past versus to conversations that people are trying to have with them in the present. There's a video that I use in my Islam in Africa and the African diaspora class, which is so fun and I love teaching it, that really sends this home for people particularly well. So Henry Louis Gates Jr., an Africanist at Harvard University, he of fame basically for doing genealogical histories where he invites people onto his show and tells them their history of, being related to either enslavers or enslaved people in the United States, did in the 90s, or no, might have been early aughts, but anyway, 20-something years ago, a set of documentaries called The Wonders of the African World, or Wonders of Africa, something like that. And in one of the documentaries, he goes to the East African coast, what we now call the Swahili coast, basically from Somalia down to Mozambique. So incorporating Kenya, Tanzania, which also includes the Zanzibari archipelago, and Somalia and Mozambique. And he goes particularly to various parts of the coast that are predominantly Muslim, which is most of the coast, except in parts of the Kenyan coastline, and talks to people there And so he voices over his experience of going to things like a Kuteb, a Quran school, where all of these young like Tanzanian kids or Pemban kids or whatever are like learning Arabic and learning the Quran. He says, this looks more like the Middle East than Africa. And then he goes and he talks to the sheikh of one of the mosques. And he asks the sheikh, sheikh is an elder who leads the mosque community. Usually implies that you are a learned individual, therefore. He says, are you Arab or are you African? Now, first of all, the terms in which he's posing that question are interesting, right? Because he's acting as if these are mutually exclusive and you have to pick one. But then the sheikh does. The sheikh says, I'm Arab. I trace my lineage. I'm a Sharif. I trace my lineage directly to the Prophet Muhammad. That's what gives me my like entitlement to a sheikhdom. That's the, you know, the lineage of learning and tutelage that I have. Those are my ancestors. And Henry Louis Gates Jr. kind of says, no, that can't be. You look like me, first of all, and Henry Louis Gates Jr. is an African-American man. And then he sort of says, but like, surely you can acknowledge that people on the Swahili coast have been mixing, even if they were Arab when they got here, with Africans the whole time. And the sheikh says, well, yes, in the past we had concubines. And they were mostly African. And Henry Louis Gates Jr. sort of presses on this and asks him, you know, why were all the concubines African? Why don't you like to talk about this? And, you know, brings up obviously histories of enslavement and things like that. But the primary thing that Henry Louis Gates Jr. can't countenance there, and I think you're talking about when you say like, oh, people will also take categories of inclusion and make them into categories of exclusion. Or people won't necessarily take a term that seems intuitive and obvious to us. They're literally in Africa. Why won't they say that they're African? As the way that they understand their experience is absolutely operational there. And one of the things that it points to is not only the sort of constitution of Arabness and Africanness, but also the constitution of the anthropologist versus the subject, of the insider versus the outsider, of how the questions are framed. All of these added layers that mean that you're not just dealing with one membrane, you're dealing with like 4 membranes that are all kind of squishing together and then still like trying to navigate that as if it's only one membrane.
Like when you do a PowerPoint and you have all the and you can decide which to push forward and you can rearrange.
Yeah. So I don't know if that helped, but
It's fabulous. It totally helps. We may only have this room until 3:30, so if we abruptly cut off, I want to make sure that everyone here knows how grateful we are for your attendance, and we can continue conversing, but I must take this moment to say, Professor Schine, what a delight. You have given us a lot to work with. You have taken us through more than a semester's of work, and I really enjoyed your 5 points. I hope everyone will join me in expressing this appreciation, and you're welcome to stay unless the call gets cut off in the next 49 seconds or so. Thank you, Professor Schine.
thank you.
Thank you.
Any parting shots? I'm waiting to see if the clock turns over or not.
It'll be interesting.
Yeah, this was
Do a
delightful.
countdown.
Thank you so much, Rachel. What a treat.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I realized I was like being too prolix and I was like, I have to cut this off and speed it up. But
It's a lot. It's a lot. And I
Yeah.
think that this, I'm now thinking about these membranes. I do think a lot about what we foreground in any given moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that is worth keeping in mind is that these like terms of identification that we think of as so much the overarching terms of identification in the US, like blackness and whiteness, are never the primaries in terms of these local interactions that I'm seeing in the text, with the exception of when people are dealing with blackness. It's never because
Yeah.
whiteness is invisibilized. Whiteness is the default.
Right.
So every so often you'll see like, look, interrupting black person, but oftentimes that person will then say, actually, I'm like a queen of Abyssinia, and here's my entire lineage, and they'll recite it and things like that. So you see people also sort of pressing against these terms and how they're used in ways that we don't see as much in US contexts because they've become so totalized and so heavily policed.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And when the terms are freighted in that way, we run into a situation where getting people to be able to listen to what we mean about something can be very difficult. And the layers of assumption and expectation are a big part of that. And who is an insider. And if someone's an insider, you're willing to give them 2 or 3 strikes before you say, okay, you've used words in a way that I'm not okay with.
Yeah.
Where it can be very hard to hear someone use words in a way that you're not okay with immediately. And then you say, well, what do I do now?
Right. Yeah, that's very true. And that's one of the things that you sort of have to ask is like, as a scholar, are you using terms that will chill dialogue before you can actually initiate it?
Right.
And that is very often the question that historians of race ask themselves. There's a guy who's a Black medievalist at Princeton, and he has a wonderful essay about this where he basically says when it comes to the topic of race, the racists have won, let them keep the word, which is his
Oh,
way of saying if we're going to do this history, we actually do need a different terminological infrastructure for it, because when people think race, they think Euro-American ideas of racism immediately, and there's no way of historicizing out from under that when that's the preset. And
exactly. Yeah.
even if I don't always agree with everything this guy has said, I think that that's a very important idea to keep in mind, because it pushes you to be very careful with what language you're using and whether it's helpful or harmful. So
Yeah. I have precisely that problem with ancient Judaism in the pre-rabbinic period, because people want to assume a rabbinic structure, but it's back reading, or in your case, globally reading something that comes from a specific place and has had an enormous impact. And you effectively pre-assume everything you might ever try to find if you start with that larger frame.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also think that there's like a particular irony when you look at the PCRS or pre-modern critical race studies, like scholarly community, of which I am only tentatively a part because a lot of them are very much in the Western European context, of like, once you acknowledge that racialization is sociogenic, that we're looking at race as a social construction, which everyone agrees we are now, that's not a biological reality, that it is not correlated with haplogroups or whatever the frick the genetic racists want it to be. Then you start kind of seeing malleable formations of lineage, cum culture, cum essence articulated almost everywhere. And then you're using the word everywhere. This, which overextends it in
Yeah.
the name of deconstructing it.
Exactly.
Which is
Exactly.
kind of insane when you think about it. Like that's, that's explicitly at cross purposes of what you're trying to do.
Well, it does make the work hard to do, but
Yeah.
but this was a super treat, and I think that everyone here will join me in saying thank you so much, and I owe you an espresso one day soon. And
Thank you.
thank you to everyone who was here. I hope you'll join us at our next event. It's a pleasure to see you, and be well. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.